It's Monday, June 23rd, 2025. Iran, you should have made the deal. We hear from all sides of the debate, and are we on the brink of World War III? Next on the AM Update.
For 40 years, Iran has been saying death to America, death to Israel.
President Trump has consistently stated for over 10 years that Iran must not get a nuclear weapon.
This is a hot war. There are two nations, Israel and Iran, trading volleys of missiles every night, every day, and we're co-belligerent now.
I understand the concern, but the difference is that back then we had dumb presidents, and now we have a president who actually knows how to accomplish America's national security objectives.
Operation Midnight Hammer went down over the weekend, and no, we're not talking about that dude who attacked Nancy Pelosi's husband. On Saturday night, President Trump announced a quote-unquote very successful attack on 3 nuclear sites in Iran. Targets included Natanz and Isfahan, along with the primary target, Fordow, which Trump said received a full payload of bombs. Trump addressed the nation and his justification for bombing Iran later in the evening on Saturday.
For 40 years, Iran has been saying death to America, death to Israel. They have been killing our people, blowing off their arms, blowing off their legs with roadside bombs. That was their specialty. We lost over 1,000 people, and hundreds of thousands throughout the Middle East and around the world have died as a direct result of their hate. In particular, so many were killed by their general, Qasem Soleimani. I decided a long time ago that I would not let this happen. It will not continue.
Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth reminded everyone that President Trump has been very, very steadfast and explicit in his belief that Iran cannot possess a nuclear weapon.
For the entirety of his time in office, President Trump has consistently stated for over 10 years that Iran must not get a nuclear weapon. Full stop. Thanks to President Trump's bold and visionary leadership and his commitment to peace through strength, Iran's nuclear ambitions have been obliterated.
Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that would be General Dan Kane, went into more detail about the specifics of the plan, just what the United States utilized to carry out that attack, and more. We'll hear in more detail and in fullness a little bit later. But crucially, he noted because of the planning and the success of that intricate plan that they pulled off on Saturday night, there was never any real threat to American lives.
We are currently unaware of any shots fired at the U.S. strike package on the way in. We are unaware of any shots fired at the package on the way out.
On Sunday morning, Secretary of State Marco Rubio joined Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan. Yes, that's the I don't really care Margaret, who continues to get abused in the best way possible by members of Trump's administration. Here she is trying to challenge Rubio on the topic of whether or not Iran was actually currently building a nuclear bomb.
Are you saying there that the United States did not see intelligence that the Supreme Leader had ordered weaponization?
That's irrelevant. I see that question being asked in the media. That's an irrelevant question.
No,
they have
that is
everything
the
they need
key
to build a
point
weapon.
in U.S. intelligence assessments. You know that.
No, it's not.
Yes, it was.
No, it's not.
The political decision had not been made.
I know that better than you know that, and I know that that's not the case.
But I'm asking you whether the order was given.
And the people who say that, it doesn't matter if the order was given. They have everything they need to build nuclear weapons. Why would you bury things in a mountain 300 feet under the ground?
Right.
Why would you bury why do they have 60% enriched uranium? You don't need 60% enriched uranium. The only countries in the world that have uranium at 60% are countries that have nuclear weapons because they can quickly make it 90. They have all the elements. They have why do they have a space program? Is Iran going to go to the moon? No. They're trying to build an ICBM.
No, but
so
that's a question. That's a question of intent, and you know in the intelligence
yes, you'd have to be about the IQ of room temperature to believe that the regime in Iran, who has been chanting death to America and have acted like they actually believe America is the great Satan for the last almost 50 years, you'd have to have the room temperature IQ to believe that they weren't actually building a nuclear weapon when they have all of these signals indicating that they are. Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu thanked President Trump for his decisive action.
Congratulations, President Trump. Your bold decision to target Iran's nuclear facilities with the awesome and righteous might of the United States will change history. In Operation Rising Lion, Israel has done truly amazing things. But in tonight's action against Iran's nuclear facilities, America has been truly unsurpassed. It has done what no other country on earth could do. History will record that President Trump acted to deny the world's most dangerous regime the world's most dangerous weapons. His leadership today has created a pivot of history that can help lead the Middle East and beyond to a future of prosperity and peace.
Back at home, Congressman Thomas Massie, who has just basically became a thorn in the side of President Trump, but he articulates a perspective here that is shared by a lot of people that I've seen on social media and elsewhere over the past 48 hours or so regarding involvement in the Israel-Iran war.
And the notion that this isn't an act of war, I find ludicrous. This is a hot war. There are two nations, Israel and Iran, trading volleys of missiles every night, every day, and we're co-belligerent now in this war. But I have another concern, and that is that 3 bombings to neutralize Iran may turn out to be the 2025 version of 2 weeks to slow the spread. This could turn into a protracted, prolonged engagement, and I'm here to represent the base of the MAGA party that got Trump elected. Most of us were tired of the wars in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, and we were promised that we wouldn't be engaging in another one. Yet here we see this happening.
Regardless of the messenger, those are some sentiments that I share as well. I've said publicly that I thought maybe bombing Fordow, bombing Iran on the part of the United States would be a sort of gateway drug into a broader engagement. Here's Vice President JD Vance addressing some of those same concerns.
I certainly empathize with Americans who are exhausted after 25 years of foreign entanglements in the Middle East. I understand the concern, but the difference is that back then we had dumb presidents, and now we have a president who actually knows how to accomplish America's national security objectives. So this is not going to be some long drawn-out thing. We've got in, we've done the job of setting their nuclear program back. We're going to now work to permanently dismantle that nuclear program over the coming years, and that is what the president has set out to do.
So what is the fallout, no pun intended now, of the U.S. involvement in the Iran-Israel war? I'm not sure this is connected, but there was a suicide bombing at the Greek Orthodox Church in Damascus. Also, Iran indicated over the weekend they're okay with shutting down the Strait of Hormuz, which would cause a massive nightmare in terms of international shipping, including, of course, oil, of which China relies around 50% on Iran and the Strait of Hormuz for their oil shipments. Back at home, Border Czar Tom Homan says he's very concerned because of the last administration and how many sleeper cells they could have allowed in through the porous southern border.
Well, look, you and I have talked about this many times. I said the last 4 years, my biggest concern was this open border was the biggest national security vulnerability this country's ever seen. So I pulled numbers this morning just from a CBP under Joe Biden. There was 1,272 nationals of Iran released in the country between OFO and the Border Patrol. And you compare that to the Trump administration, zero. Right, 0 releases. And right now, because of President Trump's leadership, we have the most secure border in my lifetime, most secure border in the history of this nation. So we have a secure border. That was President Trump's big win on securing this nation. So we're not releasing people in this country. Special interest aliens aren't crossing that border undetected. But under Joe Biden, we had over 10 million people cross that border. But my biggest concern from day one, beyond the fentanyl, beyond the sex trafficking women and children, were the 2 million known gotaways. Over 2 million people crossed that border. We don't know who they are, where they came from, because they got away, because Border Patrol is so overwhelmed with the humanitarian crisis that Biden created that over 2 million people crossed the border and got away. That is my biggest concern, and that's what created the biggest national security vulnerability this country's ever seen.
So that is the concern at home. What about the concern abroad? Are we on the brink of World War III? I read what I think is a very smart take on this. We'll read that to you coming up next.
Uncle Sam's getting pretty hot. Time to turn Iran into a parking lot. Bomb Iran, bomb, 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 bomb Iran, bomb, bomb.
Yeah, it finally happened. The United States bombed Iran. What is the continued fallout abroad of the United States involvement in this Israel-Iran war? Well, Nick Freitas is maybe a name you've heard of. He's got plenty of followers on social media. He's a former Special Forces guy, a member of the Virginia House of Delegates, and overall fairly well-liked from my friend group. Here's what he had to say, looking at this from multiple angles about the prospect of World War III breaking out over the Iran conflict. Here's what he wrote. What Israel demonstrated in their strike on Iran is that Iran does not possess the military capable of taking on a major Western power. Their primary strength lies in being able to fight through proxies, terrorism, and other asymmetric measures, which means other major powers would have to get involved on Iran's behalf to make this a World War type scenario. So are they likely to? The only two powers that could potentially have the ability to significantly up the stakes are China and Russia, both of which have cooperative diplomatic relationships as well as interests in Iranian oil. But other than realpolitik and arrangements of convenience, there is no deep cultural cohesion, no overlapping objectives, except perhaps a shared distrust for the West. So would Russia or China get involved? Let's start with Russia. Russia has a population a third of the size of the United States with a GDP that is roughly 1/15. They are already deeply engaged in a war of attrition with Ukraine. In short, Ukraine would love it if Russia decided to get involved because it would most likely mean the destruction of Putin's regime. U.S. air power would change the entire course of the war, and NATO would now be fully engaged in the conflict. Russia would have to rely on its nuclear weapons to prevent invasion, but it would probably not prevent Putin from being assassinated one way or the other. Putin knows this, so he will probably stay out. Now, of course, we need to address China. China has a much larger population and economy than Russia, not to mention that it has a huge problem with having 30 million more men than women. The centralized structure of the CCP means that choosing to go to war is a fairly straightforward process, but again, China's military looks a lot better on paper than it does in real life. Their ability to conduct sustained overseas operations is highly in question. Their naval and air capabilities would not be able to hold up against the U.S. China would most likely have to rely on their technical integration within U.S. telecoms to disrupt and delay an American response, but that's all it would be. A costly delay, not sufficient, though, to prevent the U.S. from counterattacking in such a way that would minimize their naval and air forces, thereby significantly reducing their offensive capabilities. They would also rely on their nuclear capability to save the regime and perhaps ensure territorial integrity, but it would not be able to achieve much with respect to strategic objectives. Plus, they would be putting their economy in complete peril, as a war would almost certainly shut down a trade with the West, which they are completely reliant upon. No other major powers would be likely to go to war on Iran's behalf, so other than effective vassal states like North Korea, China, or Belarus for Russia, I don't think there's much of an access powers that would emerge to offer a real threat in the form of territorial expansion. In addition to these considerations, both Russia and China probably benefit more from not getting involved. Russia will focus on Ukraine, and China will probably continue to focus on Malaysia and securing a port for Middle Eastern oil that isn't dependent on the Malacca Straits. It's also important to note that just as Russia and China are not historic allies with Iran, they are not historic allies with each other either. If Russia were to involve itself in a war with the U.S., China could pull a wild card and side with us in order to acquire portions of Russia that they need for both resources and which they see as part of their historical sphere of influence. That scenario is unlikely, but Putin would have to consider it. There's also a regional unknown we should highlight. One potential unknown is how India and Pakistan might react to such a conflict. India and Pakistan are both nuclear powers, but there's little chance India fails to win a war against Pakistan, and most of their efforts would be dedicated to that struggle as opposed to being used in other areas of larger conflict. Pakistan would likewise be forced to engage in a brutal war with India and expend the vast majority of its resources there. A potential outlier would be coordination between the Pakistanis and the Iranians to attempt to thwart the toppling of an Iranian regime, but that would open Pakistan up to additional attacks and threaten their regime as well. But under duress, who knows how they would respond. And the final unknown, Nick Freitas says, is a lot of analysis I'm conducting relies on all parties to prioritize their interests from the perspective of regime survival and their ability to accurately anticipate opposition capabilities and intentions. There is a lot of room for error, especially when one of these countries is led by a religious fanatic that does not view life and death analysis in the same way we do in the West. which, interestingly enough, is one of the reasons the Trump administration is so worried about Iran having nuclear weapons in the first place. So how likely is it that the current conflict turns into World War III? Nick Freitas writes, he says, I think it's highly unlikely. That doesn't mean impossible, but I just don't think the conditions currently exist to pull it off. Both in World War I and World War II, the battle lines kind of made sense politically, historically, culturally, and geographically. I don't think we can honestly say the same thing here. I think what is far more likely is Iran begins to back down while attempting to save face through limited demonstrations of force. Absolute best case scenario, you could see a drawdown of the conflict in Gaza and Lebanon due to a lack of funding from Iran and re-engagement of the Abrahamic Accords now that Iran's ability to thwart them has been seriously degraded and Arab countries see the United States as providing protection from Iranian aggression in exchange for fostering peace in the region. As I said in the beginning of this thread, this is not a comprehensive analysis, but rather a brief synopsis of the conditions that would be necessary to turn down what is, for now, a limited and targeted strike on Iran's nuclear facilities and IRGC into a broader World War III type conflict. That is analysis from Nick Freitas. He is a member of the Virginia House of Delegates, former Special Forces guy. And I thought that was at least very smart. Not sure if I agree with everything there, particularly when it comes to China's naval capabilities versus the West's. Really, that means the United States. Not sure about some of the assumptions, but overall, I think that was a very lucid analysis of whether or not we actually are kicking off World War III. And now here's this. This is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That would be Dan Kane. His nickname is Raisin. So Raisin Kane, with an incredible, over 4 minutes, an incredible explanation of the deception, the plan, and execution of Operation Midnight Hammer.
The bombers launched from the continental United States. As part of the plan to maintain tactical surprise, part of the package proceeded to the west and into the Pacific as a decoy, a deception effort known only to an extremely small number of planners and key leaders here in Washington and in Tampa. The main strike package, comprised of 7 B-2 Spirit bombers, each with 2 crew members, proceeded quietly to the east with minimal communications. Throughout the 18-hour flight into the target area, the aircraft completed multiple in-flight refuelings. Once over land, the B-2s linked up with escort and support aircraft in a complex, tightly timed maneuver requiring exact synchronization across multiple platforms in a narrow piece of airspace, all done with minimal communications. This type of integration is exactly what our joint force does better than anyone else in the world. At approximately 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time last night, and just prior to the strike package entering Iran, a U.S. submarine in the Central Command Area of Responsibility launched more than 24 Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles against key surface infrastructure targets at Isfahan. As the Operation Midnight Hammer strike package entered Iranian airspace, the U.S. employed several deception tactics, including decoys, as the 4th and 5th generation aircraft pushed out in front of the strike package at high altitude and high speed, sweeping in front of the package for enemy fighters and surface-to-air missile threats. The strike package was supported by U.S. Strategic Command, U.S. Transportation Command, U.S. Cyber Command, U.S. Space Command, U.S. Space Force, and U.S. European Command. As the strike package approached Fordow and Natanz, the U.S. protection package employed high-speed suppression weapons to ensure safe passage of the strike package, with fighter assets employing preemptive suppressing fires against any potential Iranian surface-to-air threats. We are currently unaware of any shots fired at the U.S. strike package on the way in. At approximately 6:40 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 2:10 a.m. Iran time, the lead B-2 dropped 2 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator weapons on the first of several aim points at Fordow. As the president stated last night, the remaining bombers then hit their targets as well, with a total of 14 MOPs dropped against 2 nuclear target areas. All 3 Iranian nuclear infrastructure targets were struck between 6:40 p.m. and 7:05 p.m. Eastern Time. Again, that's about 2:10 in the morning local time in Iran, with the Tomahawk missiles being the last to strike at Isfahan to ensure we retain the element of surprise throughout the operation. Following weapons release, the Midnight Hammer strike package exited Iranian airspace and the package began its return home. We are unaware of any shots fired at the package on the way out. Iran's fighters did not fly, and it appears that Iran's surface-to-air missile systems did not see us. Throughout the mission, we retained the element of surprise.
That is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dan Raisin Kane, over 4 minutes going into detail about Operation Midnight Hammer. Incredible stuff. When we come back, I have 3 thoughts, big picture thoughts about what we saw went down over the weekend. That's coming up next. And finally, air analysis, slightly acidic, mostly necessary. 3 thoughts on what we saw over the weekend. Number 1, time to give some major tips of the cap and a major outpouring of thanksgiving for the United States military. What we saw take place and what you just heard, the highly orchestrated, highly thought out, highly planned out operation that just, the operational security in terms of not letting any of this leak out. You let the intentionally leaked out, the B-2 bombers that headed west out of Missouri, you let that get out on purpose as a diversion tactic, as a deception tool, and you orchestrated all of these strikes over 3 disparate areas inside Iran that all took place over about 25 minutes. What we saw from the Israeli military the first night of their operation against Iran, that was pretty incredible stuff as well. I said that on Friday. What we saw here rivaled that, or maybe even surpassed it. As you heard Dan Kane say there, what the United States military does better than any military on earth is actually the collaboration between the different branches. And you just heard that play out in real time. Number 2, can you imagine a Commander-in-Chief, Joe Biden, presiding over this? I cannot. Again, I've said this often, but over the weekend, it really hit home. The Biden administration seems like 10 years ago. It feels like it was 10 years ago. I cannot imagine the messaging and the execution of such an operation being any better than what they did. Agree or disagree with the action that the United States took. And number 3, President Trump has stated for years explicitly his belief that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. No one should be surprised or aghast that what just happened. It's also been a pillar of the Iranian leadership's worldview that America is the great Satan. They've stated this over and over again for nearly 50 years, and they've acted as though they actually believe that rhetoric, starting with, when they took hostages like right after the revolution. So sometimes you just have to start taking people at their word. I was slightly in the camp of let Israel do its own thing with this and not getting involved. But here's the reality. What just happened. We bombed Iran. That happened. So you just have to adjust and move on. That was the reality. Final thing is this. I guess maybe it's 4 things, depending on how you want to divvy this up. Nobody knows for sure what's going to happen next. I err on the side of it's probably not going to be World War III, but we don't know that for sure. So let's just all take a deep breath, dispense with the certainties one way or another, and pray for peace. That's the message. Pray for peace. I hope that this brings peace to that region. Dirty little secret is that there are very few people, their Arab neighbors do not like Iran. Dirty little secret is that Saudi Arabia was probably cheering on Saturday night. They don't want to be beholden to what they probably see as a bunch of weird cultists. And yes, it's the same religion, but different sects. So let's just take a deep breath, dispense with the certainties, the doomsaying, or the I don't know, but Pollyanna-ish takes and just see how this plays out. That's all. And that'll do it for Monday. Back at it again tomorrow. I'm Aaron McIntire, and this is the AM Update.